There is a stone in the basement of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, catalog number JE 94784. It sits in a wooden storage crate on a metal shelf, wrapped in a cloth that hasn't been changed since 1999. Most of the researchers who walk past that shelf every day have never opened the crate. The documentation tag lists it simply as architectural fragment, Dendera provenance, recovered 1997. That's it. No further description, no follow-up analysis, no published paper. Just a block of dark greenish-black stone, roughly 40 centimeters long and 20 wide, with a smooth planar face on one side and a series of incised hieroglyphic lines running along its base. Most people would walk right past it, but hidden inside that stone is something that shouldn't exist. When a materials engineer from Cairo University ran a portable Gauss meter over it in 2021, not as part of any official study, but as a casual favor to a colleague, the needle didn't just move, it pegged. The stone was magnetized. Not residually, not from environmental contamination, actively, coherently, directionally magnetized in a way that implied either deliberate processing or exposure to an electromagnetic event of extraordinary intensity. The reading was later confirmed twice by two separate instruments, both times the same result. The question isn't just how a piece of stone inside an Egyptian temple basement ended up magnetized. The question is whether it was always like that, and whether the people who placed it there knew exactly what it was. If you want to follow this investigation to its end, hit subscribe now, because this story goes deeper than one stone. The Dendera Temple complex sits roughly 60 kilometers north of Luxor, on the west bank of the Nile. Dedicated primarily to Hathor, goddess of love, music, beauty, and the sky, it is one of the best preserved temple sites in Egypt. Most tourists visit the main hall. They photograph the famous zodiac ceiling. They look at the carved reliefs and move on. What they almost never see are the crypts, 14 underground crypts hidden behind removable stone slabs in the temple floor, some accessible only through concealed trapdoors in the walls. They descend 3 and sometimes 4 stories below the surface of the main hall. In ancient times, these rooms held the most sacred objects in the entire complex. According to the inventory inscriptions carved into the crypt walls themselves, the contents included golden statues of Hathor, ritual crowns, ceremonial staffs, and objects described in the hieroglyphic text as the secret things of the first time. The Zep Tepi, the mythological era before recorded history, when the gods themselves walked the earth and taught humanity the principles of civilization. For decades, scholars treated these inventory inscriptions as ritual literature, symbolic, poetic, the language of a priestly class performing the vocabulary of mystery, not recording actual objects in actual rooms. That interpretation was the dominant one. It was comfortable. It made the crypts manageable. Then modern science found something that changed everything. The fragment labeled JE 94784 was excavated during a French-Egyptian joint survey of the lower crypts in 1997. The survey was focused on structural documentation, mapping the crypt geometry, cataloging the inscriptions, assessing the stonework. The excavation team, led by a structural archaeologist from the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale, noted the block's unusual color and density. Magnetite, iron oxide, Fe3O4, is significantly heavier than the limestone and sandstone used in the rest of the temple construction. The block shouldn't have been there architecturally. It wasn't load-bearing. It wasn't ornamental. It was seated in a shallow recess in the western wall of crypt number 6, positioned with its smooth face pointing toward magnetic north. That detail was logged in the survey notes. It was not analyzed further. The block was removed, crated, transported to Cairo, and shelved. The survey report was published in a limited circulation academic journal in 2001. It has been cited exactly 4 times since. Here's where it gets strange. The inscription running along the base of that block doesn't describe a ritual offering. It doesn't invoke a goddess. It doesn't list a king's titles. Translated by a hieroglyphic specialist at the University of Göttingen, who examined photographs of the block in 2022, the inscription reads, and this is a direct academic rendering, "The stone that draws the face of the sky into its center and does not release it." A second line below that reads, "Placed here in the manner of the first craftsman who understood the pull of what cannot be seen." For decades, scholars would have dismissed that as symbolic, the kind of mystical language typical of late Ptolemaic temple inscriptions. And that's exactly what the 2001 survey report did. It called the text a dedicatory formula of uncertain function. Moved on, but that explanation has a problem. The ancient Egyptians had a word for lodestone, for naturally occurring magnetized iron ore. They called it the bone of Haroeri. This is documented. It appears in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in human history, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, where magnetic ore is listed as a remedy for pain and inflammation, prescribed specifically to disperse the invisible forces that grip the body. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a medical instruction for a material with specific documented electromagnetic properties. The Egyptians knew what magnetized stone was. They had a name for it. They used it medicinally, and someone placed a piece of it in a sealed crypt in a recessed mounting oriented toward magnetic north, with an inscription describing its fundamental property, that it pulls things toward its center and does not release them. Now let's look at the 3 things the Dendera crypt inscriptions tell us. The 3 details hidden in plain sight that no mainstream paper has ever connected to each other. The first clue is the orientation. The block was seated facing magnetic north, not temple north, magnetic north. This distinction matters enormously because magnetic north and true geographic north are different. Today, they differ by roughly 2 degrees in Upper Egypt. But in the Ptolemaic period, roughly 300 to 30 BCE, during which the current Dendera temple was primarily constructed, magnetic north and geographic north were even further apart. Whoever placed that block didn't orient it toward the stars. They oriented it toward the invisible pull of the Earth itself. That requires a working understanding of terrestrial magnetism. The mainstream position has always been that this knowledge did not exist in the ancient world. They were wrong about that for Mesoamerica. A 2021 Smithsonian study confirmed that Olmec basalt sculptures carved before 1000 BCE were deliberately magnetized in their faces and navels, oriented using the stone's own magnetic poles as a guide. Not similar to modern compass use, not inspired by it, the same. The principle is identical. And now here is Egypt. Same knowledge, same precision, same deliberate orientation. The second clue is the material composition. Magnetite doesn't occur naturally near Dendera. The nearest known natural deposits of high-grade magnetite in Egypt are in the eastern desert, near the Wadi Dib region, approximately 280 kilometers from the temple site. Someone traveled to get it, or traded for it, because it was worth something specific, not just as a decorative stone. The eastern desert magnetite was known in antiquity, pre-dynastic burials dating to the 4th millennium BCE, well over 5,000 years ago, include small iron beads of meteoritic origin with nickel content confirming extraterrestrial or deep Earth source. These beads appear consistently in high-status tombs. They weren't common, they weren't accidental, they were chosen. The block at Dendera is cut from the same geological family of iron oxide minerals, which means whoever selected it deliberately from a class of material that Egyptians had been treating as special for at least 2,000 years before the temple was even built. The third clue is the most difficult to dismiss. On the ceiling of the open crypt, directly above where the magnetite block was found, Crypt 6, the one with the carved reliefs that tourists occasionally photograph on guided tours. There is an image that Egyptologists have been arguing about since it was first properly documented in the late 19th century. It shows an elongated oval shape. Inside the oval, a serpent. The serpent is positioned upright with its head and upper body emerging from what is clearly depicted as a lotus flower at the base. Around the oval, figures in ritual posture, and the oval itself is shown emitting, for lack of a better word, rays. Lines extending outward from its surface in a pattern consistent across multiple identical repetitions of the same relief in the same chamber. For over a century, the official interpretation has been Hersomptus, the primordial god of creation, the serpent of the lotus, a religious symbol of the first sunrise, the emergence of life from the primeval waters. That interpretation is not wrong in a religious context, but it is almost certainly incomplete in a technical one. Here's the detail that changes the reading. The oval in the carving is not just floating in space. It sits on a pillar. The pillar is shown connected to a base, and the base, in several of the clearest versions of the relief, is depicted touching a rectangular flat surface, a surface that German electrical engineer Walter Garn, in a 1994 technical analysis, measured at proportional dimensions consistent with a Leyden jar configuration. Not a Leyden jar from 18th century Europe, a configuration that would produce the same electrostatic effects using different materials. Garn was not an Egyptologist. His paper was not peer-reviewed. It appeared in a fringe technical journal and was dismissed immediately. But the measurements he cited were real. They are still in the photographic record. Now combine the three clues. A magnetized stone, deliberately selected and transported, oriented toward magnetic north, placed in a sealed underground chamber directly below a carving that shows an energized, elongated vessel sitting on what looks like a high-voltage insulating pillar connected to a base. The inscription on the stone says it draws the invisible toward its center. The inventory lists on the crypt walls mention objects of the first craftsmen that must not be moved while the current flows. They weren't guessing. They were recording. In 2019, a geophysical survey team from Ain Shams University ran ground-penetrating radar across the floor of the Dendera complex as part of a broader, non-invasive mapping project. The results, published in a limited technical appendix, show a subsurface anomaly beneath Crypt 6 that extends approximately 4 meters deeper than the crypt floor itself. The anomaly has a distinct electromagnetic signature, one that the survey team attributed to dense metallic material at depth. The survey recommended further investigation. No further investigation has been conducted. The appendix sits in the technical literature, unreferenced by any major Egyptology publication. It was mapped, it was flagged, and then it was left alone. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. A magnetized stone in a temple crypt doesn't automatically mean the ancient Egyptians were running an electromagnetic power facility. That's a leap the evidence doesn't justify, and anyone telling you it does is selling something. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary, not by any reasonable scientific standard. Here is what is almost certainly true, stripped of all speculation. The ancient Egyptians understood magnetic stone. They named it, used it medically, selected it deliberately from distant sources, and placed specific specimens in architecturally precise positions within sealed ritual spaces. The Olmec did this independently. The ancient Greeks documented lodestone's properties with technical accuracy as far back as the 6th century BCE. What we are seeing is not a single culture stumbling onto magnetism by accident. We are seeing a global pattern of ancient societies that treated magnetic material as something fundamentally different from ordinary stone, something that interacted with invisible forces. The question is not whether they knew. The question is how much they knew. And that question is still open, because the Dendera inscription says the stone draws the face of the sky into its center. And the sky that ancient Egyptians pointed to most consistently was not the sun, it was the northern circumpolar stars, the stars that never set, the stars they believed to be the eternal home of the dead kings, magnetic north and celestial north in the same phrase, in the same inscription, on the same stone. If that connection is deliberate, and everything about its placement suggests it is, then what we are looking at is not just a magnetized rock. It is a technology of orientation, a way of aligning the dead, or the ritual objects of the dead, with both the physical and cosmic north simultaneously. A system for positioning objects at the intersection of terrestrial magnetism and stellar geometry. Not electricity, not science fiction. Something older than both. Something that required careful observation over many generations, practical knowledge of rare materials, and a theoretical framework that could hold magnetic, astronomical, and ritual knowledge inside a single unified system. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Not about ancient aliens, not about lost civilizations with computers, but about the real sophistication of human attention, about what people learn when they observe the same thing carefully for hundreds of years without distraction, with everything at stake. The block labeled JE94784 is still in that crate, in that basement, on that shelf. The Gauss meter readings taken in 2021 were never formally published. The researcher who took them moved to a different department. The Crypt 6 anomaly from the 2019 GPR survey is still waiting for a follow-up excavation that has not been funded or approved. The Dendera temple is open for tours every morning at 7. Visitors line up in the heat, they walk through the hypostyle hall, they photograph the zodiac. They do not go to Crypt 6. They do not know what's beneath it. The stone keeps pointing north. It always has. It doesn't need anyone to acknowledge it. It just waits. If this kind of investigation pulls at something in you, the feeling that the official story has edges that don't line up, then watch the video on screen right now about the sealed chamber they found beneath the Pyramid of Amenemhat and what the radar showed inside it. Hit like if you made it this far. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because what comes next is deeper.